some of them places like China and so on. But it's very hard because it requires massive future commitments. We'd rather build casinos. We'd rather turn our Ontario place into a casino rather than to build things that are going to be long-term, of course, in terms of productivity in our own province. So you see these examples all around us. So ultimately, what I'm really emphasizing to you is that these aren't political, regulatory, banker problems. These are social, ethical, and moral problems that go to the heart of our society and to our culture. And that's where we're ultimately going to have to address these issues. Now, back to the financial side of it very quickly. I want to go through these 5 areas, and I'll give you some charts and graphs just to drive the points home. But I do want to move through this relatively quickly just to again, just to make sure that I nail this down so that you see the gravity of the problem, if you will. So first of all, this is just debt and derivatives. And before we do that, I just put this up for a little bit of humor. Hopefully you take that as such. But all of the issues that we're dealing with are self-inflicted. We don't have to worry about our neighbor shooting us. We're shooting ourselves. And so I put this up as really the current weapon of choice from my perspective. When I look at the problems, I just can't believe we're doing this to ourselves. It makes no sense. And yet our leaders just keep running down these paths and keep going down the same sort of broken strategies, if you will. When we look at debt and derivatives, in essence, really savers have become debtors. We don't have a society where people save. Our parents' generation would save and put money aside. Now we have a society that's dependent on our parents dying maybe and transfer of inheritance or on the state. Consumption at the expense of investing. We just consume things that have very little value, and we put that as a higher priority rather than investing. Sovereign debt, as we've already talked about, government debt is beyond repayment. In most of the developed countries in the world, the sovereign debt is so large it cannot be repaid in real dollars. What I mean there is it can't be paid in dollars that are going to buy in terms of current purchasing power. They're going to have to ultimately debase it to be able to pay you. We've seen the financialization of our economy. That is, debt is capital. And this can get a little technical, and I don't want to get overly technical in this presentation, but when we look at governments and they talk about recapitalizing banks and recapitalizing their economies, all they're doing is just saying, we're just going to do more IOUs. We're just going to make more debt and more promises. There really is very little collateral in our system anymore. It's all predicated upon government fiat, government promise, government edict. And that's a very, very scary situation to be in if you have capital and you're trying to invest it. Derivatives, I mean, these financial instruments that derive their value off of underlying assets, believe it or not, you've got to invent a new word here, quadrillion. Derivatives, which are very, very mysterious, if you will, in some senses. I mean, it's hard to understand how they all work. I think the people that actually trade them don't even know. Those derivatives now are in excess of 1.1 quadrillion US dollars. And just to put that in perspective, our global GDP, the total global production in our world is running just a little under 70 trillion. So you got basically 15 times that the global economy in these derivative products. And that's why some people say, look, you have 3-4% blow up in the derivatives, that takes out over half your global GDP. And these are big, big numbers. And very few people, I don't think anybody really understands how it all works. I certainly don't. But what we've allowed here is just mass gambling of financial products on the part of our global banks. And it is insane, and it is immoral, and it's wrong. And we need to unwind those things. This particular slide just gives you a sense of what I'm trying to point out here is that if you look at the little yellow triangle at the bottom, that's really just the money that's in the central bank, sort of our money supply, if you will. And even that's not collateralized anymore. But if you look at that, everything's built on top of that. So what we're getting here, every year that goes by, we just get an inverted pyramid that gets more unstable, basically. And so that's really the point I want to drive home here. We just allow things just to pile up more and more and more. And eventually this has got to topple. This cannot continue on the rate in which we're going. Often you hear about debt to GDP ratios, and so I just put this slide up just to drive this point home. The worst debt, total debt to the production within that country in any one year, called the GDP, is Japan. Japan's debt to GDP, believe it or not, is well over 200%. Here's an interesting little factoid here. The Japan debt is 25 times the annual government's revenue. 25 times. This is a country that's right on the precipice of, and it's a very dangerous position Japan's in right now. They can only survive by having interest rates under 1% on all of that debt. If interest rates were to go up by 0.5%, they'd completely topple over. And that's why you hear, if you're listening to the news, that Japan is basically just printing yen. They're trying to get their yen to go down as much as possible in order to survive and at least export out of their country. But if you look at some of these other countries, you'll see that there's just massive problems in terms of debt. The United States now, really the AAA country, supposed to be the strongest in the world, is well over 100% now of debt to GDP. So serious, serious problems. This particular slide just emphasizes that a lot of economic theory says, hey, you know what? You go further into debt, you drive the economy up. It's wonderful. You get a multiplier effect. Some of you have studied economics. You've heard that sort of those sort of theories. A lot of them are nonsense. I would suggest, having spent 4 plus 1 plus undergraduate plus an MBA and then my CFA, the majority of what you learned in these programs, unfortunately, is not overly helpful, probably more dangerous than anything. But the reality is debt can be used wisely, but once you have excess debt, you're going to get very little bang out of it. Of course, and you're going to create other problems. And so what this slide shows is that post-World War II, every dollar of new debt added over $4 of GDP. Well, you'd say, that's pretty good. That's really getting a lot of bang for your dollar. Maybe the expansion of debt makes sense because you're really getting a big expansion in your production. But that quickly tailed off, and you can see as the decades went on, in the 50s through the 80s, a dollar of debt added about 63 cents. But the most important area that I'd zero in on the last 10 years, a dollar of debt has added about 8 cents in production. In other words, all this debt we're adding on, we're getting nothing for it, but permanent debt on us. We're not getting growth. This is a serious, serious problem. So when these politicians and economists come around and say, well, let's just pile up more debt, we got to keep this thing going, because once it pulls back a bit, it'll just cascade down into a depression. Which I admit will take place, and I think it will be forced upon us at some point anyway, because we're going to have to clean this debt up. But the reality is, look what we're getting for that new dollar that we're putting on there, that someone actually thinks that's an asset. Someone's actually buying that and thinking they're going to get the return. We're getting 8 cents of production out of it. This is also going to end. This won't work. How do you get out of debt? I just put a quick slide up here. You hear this, you can grow your way out of debt. Problem is, a lot of our economies aren't growing much. They're so super saturated debt. You can lower interest rates. We've lowered interest rates to, they're actually negative in real terms. And we can't do that much more. You get a bailout. You get some country to try to forgive the debt. Difficult for the US to get a bailout, Japan to get a bailout, European Union to get a bailout, although they're working on it. Fiscal plan, you try to, again, arrange your finances a little more intelligently, and we can see that that's very hard to do. People do not want their government to cut anything. And so fiscal austerity is a very difficult thing to actually engineer from a government perspective. And so the last two is where we're really going. You just print money, try to create inflation, debase your currency, devalue your debt, because your debt becomes easier to pay as you debase your currency. Or you just do explicit defaults. You walk from it, you tell the person that they're not going to get their money. And interestingly enough, people say, well, governments don't default, do they? I mean, people say that in Canada because we've had fairly responsible government over our life. Same thing in the US to a certain degree, although they had significant defaults at the Civil War, if you go back long enough. But this slide just shows you that if you take the period from 1800 to 2010, so that's 210 years, Greece, our favorite country, it's been in default over 50% of the time. If you look at Russia, it's been default pretty close to 40% of the time. Think of Germany. People say, well, Germany is this great, bastion of strength, and they never default. Well, they've been in default about 13% of the time. Most of that in the last century at the beginning period. They had tremendous problems, tremendous default, hyperinflation, didn't pay their bills, and so on. And so even if we go back in my life in the financial industry in the 90s, you had defaults through the Far East. You had Russian defaults. You've had Argentina. Looks like they'll do it a couple of times, and so forth. So this isn't anything new. Governments default. Governments get out of control, and they don't pay their bills. So again, don't be surprised by this. This shouldn't surprise us. And so I just put this slide up to give you a little bit of sense of that. The next area that I just want to touch on briefly is if you think debt's bad, that's the actual tradable debt that the governments have put out there that people have bought the other side and think they own a bond of value, then think of the unfunded liabilities. Think of the promises. Because remember, it's a lot easier to make a promise than to actually fulfill it, right? And so, as you know, governments love to make promises, and we like to take them. We like when the government buys our vote, if you will. This is this is a major practice now, as you know, in most of our Western countries. And so what I want to point out here is governments have made enormous promises without setting the money aside. In other words, they haven't funded it. That's why they're unfunded. Promises facilitated really by fiat currency. In other words, if you can just print money and you don't have to have it backed by gold, you can have a lot of fun. You can have quite the party. You can promise a lot of things. And those promises, as I've put here, are kind of off balance sheet. You don't see them. We don't, in the United States, for example, the unfunded liabilities, people estimate them at somewhere between $60 to $100 trillion. Well, their existing debt is $16 trillion. It gives you a sense of the gravity of the situation. And their whole economy only produces $16 trillion of value a year. And you're saying, how can they have unfunded liabilities of 70 plus trillion? How does that happen with, MIT PhDs running our finances? Well, it happens. It happens. And it's a serious problem. So the examples of unfunded liabilities include pensions, of course, medical promises, social welfare promises, and so forth. And this slide that I have here just shows you, if you thought the red was bad, and that's the debt to GDP in these countries, then look at the gray bar. That's the unfunded liabilities and the promises. They are beyond comprehension. I'll leave it at that. They're beyond comprehension. We should be outraged at what the governments have promised, and we willingly have wanted to accept. Because it takes two to tango here. As I said, ultimately, this is really an ethical and moral crisis that we face in our economy. Part of this, as I just put this slide up here, not to pick on public workers, but the public workers, this is out of the United States, is very similar throughout the developed world. You can see that the public purse has been very generous. And so if you work in private industry, on average, you're making half of the comparable if you work for the government. And so those unions that the governments have, which I don't think government should have unions, because ultimately, what do they need a union for when the ultimate side, we're paying it, the taxpayers are on the other side of that. But that's a different issue. The reality is, as the governments become larger and larger and hired more people, it pays them a lot more. And it promises them a lot more. And these are huge unfunded liabilities. Just to bring this home, let me just talk a little bit about Ontario teachers, because they right currently are quite hot and heavy about the fact that they're underpaid and they are abused and not treated very well, and they're not very happy with their system and so forth. But did you know that the Ontario teachers are the highest paid teachers in North America? In fact, teachers in Canada are about 50% more. They earn about 50% more than the average teachers in the developed world, just looking at the developed world.